Delhi, the 20th of September, 1857. Smoke still rises over the Red Fort. British soldiers pour through the Kashmiri Gate, bayonets fixed, and the last Mughal emperor, a frail poet, king of 82, has already fled into the shadows of Humayun's tomb. But somewhere inside the crumbling walls of the palace, a young woman kneels beside a window, watching the empire her family built over 3 centuries collapse in a single afternoon. She is a Mughal princess, and in the chaos of that day, she vanishes from the official record, almost entirely leaving historians, journalists, and her own descendants to piece together, decades later, what actually happened to her. This is the story of what became of the women left behind when the Mughal dynasty fell, not the emperor, whose trial and exile are well documented, not the princes, whose fates were brutal and public, but the princesses, the daughters and granddaughters of Bahadur Shah Zafar, who simply disappeared into the ruins of Delhi and whose survival decades later would shock a nation that had assumed the Mughals were extinct. Delhi, May 11th, 1857, 4 months earlier. Sepoys from Meerut arrive at the gates of the Red Fort, blood still wet on their uniforms, and declare Bahadur Shah Zafar the leader of a rebellion he never asked to lead. Zafar is 81 years old at this point, a man who writes ghazals, not battle plans. He rules over a Mughal empire that, in truth, no longer exists. His authority stretches barely beyond the walls of the fort itself, propped up by a British pension of 100,000 rupees a year. But symbolism matters more than power. To the rebels, he is still the emperor. To the British, he is about to become the most dangerous man in India. Not for what he does, but for what he represents. Inside the fort, his household is enormous. Zafar has fathered dozens of children across multiple wives and consorts. Historians estimate somewhere between 20 and 30 surviving sons and daughters. Sons and daughters by 1857. Among them is a princess whose name would later surface in British records as Kulsum Zamani Begum, one of the emperor's daughters, born into luxury inside the zanana, the private women's quarters of the palace, and raised with no reason to expect anything but a life of silk, servants, and ceremony. She has never known hunger. She has never known fear. That is about to change. September 1857, the siege of Delhi enters its final brutal phase. British and Indian troops fighting under the East India Company's flag storm the city street by street. Casualty estimates for the final assault alone run past 1,000 British and Indian soldiers, with rebel and civilian deaths in Delhi climbing into the thousands over the following weeks. Captain William Hodson, a cavalry officer with a reputation for ruthlessness, tracks the fleeing emperor to Humayun's tomb and negotiates his surrender with a promise of safety. Zafar accepts. It is a decision that will define the rest of his life, and one that will not extend the same mercy to his sons. The next day, Hodson rides out again, this time for the emperor's heirs. He finds 3 princes: Mirza Mughal, Mirza Kizar Sultan, and Mirza Abu Bakr, and orders them to strip before a jeering crowd at the Kuni Darwaza, the bloody gate, before shooting them dead with his own pistol. Hodson later writes home that he felt no remorse. "I am not cruel," he insists, "but I confess I did rejoice. For the daughters of the family, no bullet waits at the gate, but something arguably crueler does erasure. While the sons are executed and the record of their deaths carefully kept, the fate of the princesses is barely documented at all. Nobody thinks to write down what happens to the women. They simply become nobody." October to November 1857. The British empty the Red Fort. Zafar is placed under arrest, his household scattered, his remaining treasures looted or seized as spoils. What happens next to the royal women depends on which account you believe, and this is where the story shifts from documented history into something closer to oral memory, pieced together from British administrative notes, later journalistic investigations, and the testimonies of the family's own descendants. Some princesses, protected by loyal servants or minor nobles, still holding on to scraps of influence, managed to flee the city before the worst of the reprisals. Others are captured and held for questioning, their jewels confiscated as evidence of rebel wealth. A number are simply turned out of the palace with nothing, no pension, no protection, no name that means anything anymore outside those crumbling walls. The British administration, eager to dismantle any symbol of Mughal legitimacy, has little interest in cataloguing the welfare of imperial daughters. Why would they? The dynasty is finished. Its women are, in the eyes of the new order, irrelevant. But irrelevance is not the same as disappearance. And one princess's story would resurface nearly 70 years later in a way nobody expected. Rangoon, Burma, November 1862. Bahadur Shah Zafar dies in exile, buried in an unmarked grave that the British deliberately conceal, fearful that a marked tomb might become a shrine for future rebellion. He dies with a final couplet reportedly on his lips, mourning that he could not even find 2 yards of earth in the land he once ruled. It is a fittingly bitter epitaph for a man who watched his empire, his sons, and his home taken from him in the span of a single year. Meanwhile, back in India, the surviving members of his family scatter into obscurity. Pensions that once flowed to Mughal nobility dry up almost entirely. Titles that once commanded armies now command nothing but silence. For the princesses who remain in Delhi or drift toward other cities, Lucknow, Hyderabad, Calcutta, survival means one thing above all, hiding who they are. A Mughal name in post-1857 India is not a badge of honor. It is a liability, a mark that can invite suspicion, harassment, or worse from a colonial government still paranoid about any hint of royalist sentiment. So they hide. Some marry into lesser noble families under altered names. Some take on work never meant for royal hands, sewing, domestic labor, even according to later reports, begging in the very streets their ancestors once ruled from horseback. It is a fall so steep it barely registers as real, and for decades almost nobody in British India or independent India thinks to ask what actually happened to them. Then, in the 1920 seconds, a story breaks that stuns the country. Delhi, 1925 to 1930 seconds, nearly 70 years after the fall. Journalists and local historians, digging through the forgotten corners of old Delhi, begin uncovering the trail of the emperor's surviving descendants, and what they find is almost unbelievable. Reports emerge of Mughal princesses, direct descendants of Bahadur Shah Zafar, living in conditions of extreme poverty. Within the very city, their family once ruled as absolute sovereigns. One account, later cited by multiple Indian newspapers and historians researching the Mughal aftermath, describes an elderly royal woman discovered living in a slum near the old city, identified through her family's oral testimony as a granddaughter or great-granddaughter of the last emperor, surviving on charity and the memory of a name nobody around her recognized anymore. The detail that captures public imagination most is almost too poetic to be believed. Descendants of an empire once worth untold millions, reduced to selling small goods on the street or relying on neighbors for food, their imperial bloodline meaning nothing in a colonial economy that has no use for deposed royalty. Whether every detail of these accounts is fully verifiable is still debated among historians. Records from this period are thin, oral histories vary, and some retellings likely blend the stories of multiple descendants into a single dramatic narrative. But the broader truth beneath the sensational headlines is not disputed. The Mughal royal family, once the wealthiest dynasty on the subcontinent, was, within a lifetime, reduced to destitution so severe that its princesses became indistinguishable from the poorest residents of Delhi. How does an empire's bloodline end up begging in its own capital? The answer lies not in one dramatic moment, but in decades of deliberate policy and decades of silence. 1858 to the early 1900 seconds, the long, quiet dismantling. After the rebellion, the British Crown formally takes over from the East India Company, and one of its first priorities is making absolutely certain the Mughal name can never again serve as a rallying point. The remaining family members are stripped of royal recognition. Pensions, where they exist at all, are minimal and often entangled in bureaucratic delay that can stretch for years. Marriages between remaining Mughal descendants and other noble families become